If you're a gamer on a budget, you still want a PC that delivers incredible performance without breaking the bank. While super high-end rigs are amazing, not everyone needs or can afford that kind of powerhouse. But that doesn't mean you have to compromise on quality or future-proofing. For $1,500, you can build a system that offers fantastic performance, reliable components, and great value for money, all while staying ready for the latest games for years to come. That's why we've teamed up with XPG and ADATA to put together this great looking and performing $1,500 gaming PC. Now, when we think about a gaming PC with a set budget, we have to be a bit more cautious about the parts that we choose because, firstly, we don't want to exceed that budget, but more importantly, we want to make sure that we're getting the very best bang for our buck with components. And because this is a gaming PC, the GPU is going to be at the heart of the build and will likely swallow up most of that budget anyway. On the flip side though, I think there is room for sacrifice when it comes to aesthetics, so we're also prioritising how the build looks in all its glory. Now before we get into the build and those all-important benchmarks, let's talk about what we've actually got here, the parts themselves, starting things off with the CPU. Now, while I'd love to throw a 7800X3D or 9800X3D into this system, that's not going to be feasible on our budget, so instead we need to think a bit more conservatively. Which is why we went with the Ryzen 5 7600X. It's currently priced around the same as the non-X part, so it gives us some extra value considering it gives us much higher clock speeds of 4.7 GHz on the base clock and 5.3 GHz boost clock, along with 6 cores and 12 threads, making it perfect for a budget gamer. It's not the latest chip on the market when comparing to the 9600X, but at $50 more, that's a choice that you'll have to make if you have the extra cash to splash on having the latest CPU. Though prices have already come down since its initial launch, so we may see the 9600X fall even more in the very near future. Now when it comes to motherboards and sticking with a theme, only one really springs to mind, and that is the NZXT N7 B650E with its white armour that really stands out and will be a key centrepiece to our build. It also packs in tons of features including a potent 16+2+1 power phase design rated for up to 90 amps each, support for Gen 5 storage which is perfect if you want to future-proof your system for the next generation of blazing fast SSDs, and includes Wi-Fi 6E and plenty of USB ports, ensuring you'll have all of the connectivity that you need for peripherals, streaming setups, or even VR gear down the line. Plus, the board's compatibility with NZXT's CAM software means you'll have no trouble managing your fan curves and RGB lighting to match your build's aesthetics. For the memory, we've gone with XPG's Lancer Blade RGB DDR5 32GB 6000MHz. Being AMD, we've gone for the sweet spot of 6000MHz to keep the Infinity fabric in check, and 32GB is more than enough for even the most modest gaming build right now. And being white means that it ties in with the rest of our system, while also giving us that all-important RGB, which, as we know, makes everything look and perform better. For our storage and keeping within budget, we've gone with the ADATA Legend 970 Pro 1TB NVMe drive. It's a Gen 5 drive, but thanks to the Innogrit IG5666 controller, ADATA have been able to keep prices a little lower than the competition, while still offering blistering fast performance of up to 14,000 megabytes a second on the read and 11,000 megabytes a second on the write speeds. Available in up to 4TB capacities, we've gone with the 1TB to fit our budget, but obviously go with whatever your budget allows. As while speed may change slightly from capacity to capacity, the extra space really is the only major difference. But if you want to save some cash here, you could always plump for a Gen 4 or even a Gen 3 drive instead. Now for games, we've gone with the 7700XT from Sapphire. But this one is a little special as it's the Pure model, which means it's white, and I will admit it's one of the best looking graphics cards on the market with its striking all white design. Packing 12GB of VRAM and being perfectly positioned for 1440p gaming, it's also the perfect card for high refresh rate 1080p gaming as well, or even for those who want to maybe dabble in a bit of light 4K gaming. Though of course you will have to reduce the quality settings a little bit or make use of FSR to help boost performance back up, especially if wanting to utilise ray tracing. Now, I'm all about looks, and Sapphire have something kind of sneaky up their sleeves, as for around the same price you can actually bag yourself the Frostpunk 2 version. Not only does it come with those gorgeous looking white aesthetics on the front, but the back incorporates the Frostpunk 2 graphics that shows that it really means business, along with getting a copy of the game and some added goodies to give that all important extra value. In terms of cooling, we've gone with the XPG Levante X 240mm AIO. It's XPG's latest iteration of liquid cooler, and being 240mm with eTeknix 7th gen pump, it should have no problem keeping our 7600X under control. In terms of style, it has an infinity mirror CPU block, and it comes with those amazing looking RGB fans, so it's going to make our whole system look like a bit of a light show. But if that's not your thing, you can always decide to turn it off or just dictate the colour scheme based on your particular needs. Also, due to it being daisy chainable, it does mean cable management should be very easy. Then for the power supply, we've gone with the XPG Core Reactor II 850 watt unit. Being 850 watt means that it's more than up for the task of handling our components, as well as giving us some extra headroom for the future. And being ATX 3.1 compatible also means that we have the latest technologies and standards at our fingertips, including that all-important 12V PWR connector if you're using an NVIDIA-based GPU, of which we're not using one today, but it's handy to have regardless. It's also 80 plus gold and cybernetics platinum, fully modular, and comes in this really amazing looking white, which again will match our case very nicely. Which leads me on to that, the case. And for this build, we're using the XPG Invader X Mini, a case that XPG claims to be a mini case with a max view. But don't be confused by the name, as this chassis can still house up to an ATX motherboard, as well as having support for a 240mm radiator in the top, like the Levante X240 that we're using, PSUs up to 180mm in length, CPU coolers up to 166mm in height, and graphics cards up to 330mm. So even though it's a small case, there's no compromises on the components that can actually be put inside. It also features the ability to house up to 5 120mm fans, which also come included as part of the case, with one being a regular orientation and the other 4 being reversed, so that you get that all-important airflow through the mass amounts of mesh on the front and sides, while also giving you a full view of those blades and that all-important RGB. They've also put a lot of thought into this case for system builders, as the toolless removable front panel allows you to get to those niggly parts of any build without being constricted by space, while still offering up a full view of your system in all its glory. So there we have it, a build for $1,500, and while some trade-offs could be done, like going for a slower Gen 4 drive or a B650 non-E motherboard to save on some cash, or simply to put into a higher end GPU like the 7800 XT or 7900 GRE, again in white to match the build. But I think we've actually managed to strike a nice balance of looks, performance and value for money. Though, me personally, I'd probably try to plump for the 7800 XT, as, well, there's not much in it price-wise. Though the reason I didn't here today is that I didn't actually have one available. So, needs must and all that. So, with all of the parts out the way, let's get into one of the main reasons why you're here, the all-important build. So first things first, as always, we want to build as much as we can outside of the case to kind of make our lives just that little bit easier. And this means grabbing the motherboard, the processor, the memory, and also the SSD. Then we can line up our CPU with the arrows, just like so, pull this down, pull the lever across, and done. So first things first, we do need to take the heatsink off of this because the motherboard we're using actually has its own built-in heatsink. So then we can look at removing the heatsink, which is now going to keep our Gen 5 drive nice and cool. We can get the drive itself, which can only go in one way because it has got a notch on there, like so, and get the heatsink back in and screw back down. And for the memory, we want to make sure that we're using slots 2 and 4 to get the kind of very best performance that we can out of this 6000 MHz kit that we're using. Also, this is a good time to see if there's anything that we actually need to do in terms of the CPU cooler, as depending on the platform that you're actually using, whether it be AMD or Intel, you may need to remove certain retention brackets or swap out the pre-installed bracket, which in this case, this does come with a Intel bracket kind of pre-installed on the AIO itself, as well as some included thermal paste, but we're going to be swapping it out for this AMD bracket instead. So we're also going to be putting the cooler into the top of the case, and wanting to keep everything theme-wise in sync, we're going to be swapping out the fans. So instead of using these Ventor Pro 120 RGB fans, we're actually going to remove the 2 from the top of the case and install them onto the radiator. So yeah, these I guess you could sell, you could get rid of, maybe try and recoup some of your cash back, or just keep them in the box for maybe upgrades at a later date. We can then look to fit our motherboard into place, of course making sure that all of the standoffs are in the correct location. And then, once it's in place, we can look at screwing it down. We can also look at fitting these two reverse blade fans at the bottom to give us even more RGB and, of course, huge amounts of airflow that's going to come in from the mesh on the side and also on the front. So with the front panel connectors in and these reverse fan blade fans in as well, I want to talk about the power supply, which, as we mentioned, is the Core Reactor II 850 watt. But I mainly want to talk about this because from building experience, fitting the EPS connectors now is always a good idea before the radiator actually goes in. So we can basically get this unboxed, we can look at taking the relevant cables that we're going to need out and just figuring out what cables we're actually going to need so that we can get those EPS connectors installed along with our 24 pin before we actually put the radiator in, which is going to be quite restrictive. So things are really starting to come together quite nicely, but now it's time to get the radiator installed in the top and obviously without any restrictions because we've already got our EPS power connectors installed. We can then also fit the CPU block into place with obviously some thermal paste that's pre-applied, helping us to bridge the gap and give us that perfect contact. So the final piece of the puzzle is of course the GPU in all its glory. So taking it out of the box and, well, frankly, just taking a minute to admire this thing of beauty. We can take out the relevant brackets, which I always sort of say you should line up the GPU first because you don't want to be caught out. But generally speaking, it is slots 2 and 3. So we can take them out and then get our GPU and line it up and install it into place. Then we can put the cables in, and apart from a little bit of, let's say, light cable management on the other side, we are done. So the real question comes down to, does it turn on? And of course it does. There was never any doubt. I mean, there was a little doubt. There's always a little bit of doubt. But do you know what? Generally speaking, when you do turn on a PC for the first time, you never quite know what the RGB is going to do. I've had it be rainbows, I've had it be solid red. But do you know what? For this type of build, with the white just coming on straight away as default, it kind of works. Obviously, we need to change the color of the memory, or we need to change the color of the fans to kind of, sync up with the memory. But I think overall, that looks pretty damn clean and a little bit sort of fitting for this time of year. But I guess the real reason that you're here, apart from all the glitz and glam, is to see exactly how this is going to perform. So let's get into them glorious, glorious benchmarks. Starting things off with some eSport titles, and with Apex Legends coming up first. It's here where we see some really strong performance whilst in-game at 1440p with high settings, with performance sticking pretty closely to the 144 FPS cap that the game has by default. Whilst there is a way to unlock the frame rate slightly with launch commands, we didn't think it was worth testing, as if we can stick to the cap well enough, then it means we could quite possibly see ourselves getting more than playable performance from higher resolutions such as 4K. Particularly if we lower settings a little, and with temperatures staying under control the whole time, we don't have to worry about thermal throttling either. Sticking with the esports theme, Fortnite is up next, and we saw some pretty good performance here too, with high points in the frame rate up to around 130 frames per second. But with dips down to as low as 60, this doesn't seem maybe quite so impressive. That is until you realise that ray tracing is enabled and settings are maxed out, with some upscaling turned on, which means that we could easily see well beyond 130 FPS if ray tracing was disabled. And with our temperatures sticking around the mid to high 70-degree mark, things are getting warm, but it's nothing unmanageable. With titles like this, I would generally recommend running lower settings anyway to boost your frame rate, but it's always nice to know that if you do want to boost the visuals, then you're not sacrificing playability. Moving on to Spider-Man Remastered, another pretty well optimised game that generally sees good frame rates. It's here where we see an average of around 240 FPS while swinging around New York City. Temperatures are again sticking to around the mid-70s, which is pretty typical for gaming, so well, there's nothing really to worry about here, and it shows that the system with its 5 fans is doing its job well. The performance is obviously more than welcome, but what's more impressive is that we're running this with ray tracing turned on, and that's just the magic of frame generation. Obviously, you could disable frame gen if it isn't your thing, and you'd still be getting perfectly playable frame rates. But with this kind of performance, you could also end up playing at 4K without much trouble at all. Cyberpunk 2077 was our next game, as this is a bit of a golden example for any system, with support for all the latest technologies, and generally being just a great game overall, which makes it a bit more fun to test. With frame rates sitting around 80 FPS in busier areas and around 90 in less busy areas, this is more than a playable experience, and like the rest of the games we've tested that support it, we did play this with upscaling and ray tracing enabled, meaning we're making the most of our 7700 XT while still having headroom to turn down some settings and play at a higher resolution. Or if you want to increase the visuals a bit and play at a lower frame rate, then you still have enough headroom to be getting playable frame rates. And with the CPU temperature sticking around the low 70-degree mark and the GPU sitting around the mid-80s, we also have plenty of cooling headroom to allow for steady levels of performance. To finish up, we tested one of the most intensive games that we own, which is Alan Wake 2, and it's no surprise to say that it did struggle a little more with this title. But with frame rates still sitting around 70 to 80 FPS for the most part, this is still more than enough to play this kind of game. Temperatures here are pretty much what you'd expect. The CPU takes a bit of a backseat to the GPU and is only at about 60 degrees as a result, while the GPU is at a higher 80 degrees for the most part, but that's still a perfectly reasonable temperature, especially for such an intensive game. Again, ray tracing is on, but given how intensive this game is, we only had it on low, and again there are options which would sacrifice settings to allow you to play at a slightly higher resolution, as this is a very impressive game in terms of the visuals, and me personally, well, I'd much rather prefer to take in the details. So there we have it, a $1,500 gaming PC build done. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, you could tweak things about a bit to free up more budget for maybe a higher end GPU. But I feel that would be at the mercy of sacrificing some of those awesome looking aesthetics of the whole build, which I'm actually extremely pleased with. And it would be a shame to have to take this one apart because, especially as it is about 0 degrees outside, it's rather fitting and kind of looks, well, extremely clean and kind of frozen in a way. Let me know, what parts would you change if anything? For me, I guess for most people, a lower end motherboard would help cut down on costs, maybe even going for a Gen 4 SSD. But the drive that we've put in there for the price that it is comes in extremely competitively. The other thing I really like about this build is, well, it's extremely quiet and we haven't actually done anything to the fan curve. This is basically as it comes. Now remember, if you want to buy any of the parts featured in this build, then there is a full list below, and it helps us by giving us a little bit of a kickback as well, which is always hugely appreciated. I also want to say thank you to ADATA and XPG for sponsoring this build because it's always great working with their components, and I'll be honest, I'm actually really liking this case. So yeah, that's going to kind of wrap this one up. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can also help support us by joining the super special Patreon family, where you'll get access to a whole host of goodies, including behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, access to a lot of our testing data, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.